Thank you very much, Gerald, and good morning to all of you. I'd like to begin by three statements of sympathy. First, sympathy to the place, to Bar-Ilan University. Bar-Ilan is not my own university, but I feel very much at home, and I'm grateful for being invited here. I do take credit, however, as some people know, for having the Bar-Ilan statement of the Prime Minister being delivered here. I wish I could say I contributed to the substance of the speech, but no, I did not. He did not consult me. I saw the drafts as they were being prepared. But logistically, I was the one who brought it to Bar-Ilan. So to this, I take much credit. And logistics, you all know, is very, very important. Also, technically speaking, I am glad that the Prime Minister had resuscitated the Bar-Ilan speech, because during the election, somehow he distanced himself to the Bar-Ilan, and I think that Bar-Ilan voiced some opposition that he did so without consulting the president and others. But he corrected himself quickly, and we are all satisfied that the Bar-Ilan statement is back in town. I'm speaking only half seriously, mind you. Practically everything I will be saying is not fully serious, but there is a grain of seriousness in it. So much for sympathy to Bar-Ilan. My other sympathy is to the president. You see, I had the pleasure of sitting in many, many lengthy cabinet meetings in which the president sat as a minister. For a number of years, he was the Minister of Science. Now, when you sit in those lengthy cabinet meetings, you get bored because most of the subjects are not interesting. So you look at people, and I often looked at him. And I looked at his face, and you see he's a mathematician by training. And at certain points, you could see that he was just perplexed by the ability of those who do not have a clear, crisp mind to obscure the issues, which to him, in his very rigorous mathematical faculties, he could understand the issues and take them to the logical conclusions when everybody else was there, politically wondering. It was a pleasure to see him in action because he was not only a good political leader, but he was certainly among the very brightest in so many ways.
I think that I should now go.
And my last tone of sympathy is to you people. You, members of the diplomatic community, ambassadors, diplomats, and whatever other things you may be doing. I used to be a so-called diplomat too, you see. So I have the fullest of sympathy for you, because I think we have successfully made you predict wrong. Now, I'd like to see a show of hands, or somebody say that they, in their last cables to the capitals, predicted the outcome of the elections. So you see, this is our uncanny ability to make life difficult to those who serve here. We share the same problem, because we too were surprised, myself included. The point is, nobody had asked me responsibly to give an assessment. You were asked. Let me give a piece of advice. Next time capitals ask you to predict anything about Israel, refuse at all costs. Say that Washington, my trick to you is to say the following: we don't know, but maybe you should consult our embassy in Washington. They should know better. But to those Americans here, I would ask, did America call the elections any better? So I have much sympathy to you. In fact, when I was an official myself and had a great deal of interaction with foreign diplomats serving here, I really felt much empathy because I was thinking, if I were to be assigned to a country like Israel, having to report on what goes on, it is so difficult, really, to know what the hell is going on, that you have a very difficult life. And we're not making it any easy. I could give you some pieces of advice what to avoid, but how to get it right, there's no way. So it is this expression of sympathy to you all, and I wish you much success. Try to avoid the unnecessary pitfalls, and with that tone of sympathy, I will conclude my initial comments. So, still, if I should be of any service, let me give you a prediction. Of course, what you're seeing now in terms of the coalition negotiations is not the real thing. It's complicated, as they say. It's multidimensional. There are the negotiations, there are negotiations behind the negotiations, there are tacit negotiations, there are people playing with futures. This is very sophisticated bargaining taking place. Now, the fashion, the day, today, is to discuss about the inevitability of a possibility of a national unity, but don't believe that either, because once you think about that, it becomes even more complicated, and the complications are, compound. The only thing that leads, if there were no time limit, we would have probably been negotiating endlessly, because it allows for that. But there is a time limit, so time limits tend to concentrate people's mind. So at one point, people will take a position and will conclude. But how will that end? I have no clue. And if you are asked to give your prediction, as I said, refuse at all costs and pass the buck to someone else. With this observation about the nature of the situation, let me therefore confine the rest of my comments to the issues at hand, to those issues which are on the agenda, and to actually putting myself in, not in your shoes actually, but trying to take a hard look of where those issues are. Now, mention was made about the negotiation in Switzerland, but you see, you said Geneva. It's not Geneva, it's Lausanne. And today I saw in the paper a quote from The Guardian saying that the reasons that the negotiators, there's a lot of spying, so-called spying, on the positions taken by the negotiators, and that's a big story unto itself, which of course is completely manipulated. But then there is this Guardian guy says that the negotiators themselves in Lausanne are so aware that they are being spied on, that they walk out of the hotel, go into the gardens, try to talk this way, and perhaps they think that they would elude surveillance. Let me tell you, the Beau Rivage in Lausanne is impossibly, it is penetrated from all directions, and all those who go into the gardens are walking exactly into where they would be listened to. So it is pathetic, this kind of story, but it's part of games being played today internationally that this is also becoming an issue. The negotiations, however, themselves are serious. And as you know, on this issue, this is perhaps the only issue in which now we have the Israeli government taking a different position altogether, almost a diametrically opposed position than the one that the President of the United States is trying to steer, because Israel is convinced that the deal that may be negotiated is harmful, and says so openly, and seeks to influence the attitude taken by the negotiating parties, and that is not the position of the United States. So here we are differing on the issue. Now, if you look at it from a distance to try to make a determination, is it a bad deal or is it a good deal? Everything is relative. It's relative to your objectives. It's relative to the possibilities. Maybe one couldn't obtain anything better. And behind the thing, one should not be drawn into exaggerations of any kind. One should not applaud the deal that is coming clearly in its own elements. If you compare the starting position of the negotiators and their hopes and what is now unfolding, clearly it falls short even of the aspirations of the negotiators themselves. I'm talking about the six. So that it is not one that could be celebrated because, as said, it allows the Iranians to retain much of their capabilities, and it does not achieve what seemed to have been the plausible objectives when they started the negotiations. But neither should one declare an agreement as being catastrophic. I don't think that such hyperbole is serving any useful purpose. One can live with anything. Everything in life is relative, and it entails costs and prices and benefits and payoffs, and nothing is catastrophic and nothing is apocalyptic. The position should have been that one could have possibly, through a more judicious and consistent position on being determined to prevent Iran from having any such capabilities to produce nuclear weapons in the future, one could have secured that goal. But there has been a relaxation in that determination. The language employed by the President of the United States in 2012 was much more assertive. It was so declared that at no point will the United States consider containing and deterring Iran, and that the United States was squarely within the camp of being determined to prevent Iran from acquiring such capabilities, and that all options are on the table, and that should all other measures fail, there is a possibility of a use of force. Well, that tone has dissipated over the years, and by 2013, 2014, we find a different music there, and the music shapes the outcome, and the outcome is one of bargaining now. The Iranians are driving a hard bargain. They're good at what they're doing from their point of view, and if they would succeed in having a very quick lifting of the sanctions on one hand, and retain so much of their potential capability on the other hand, well, it's a major Iranian accomplishment. That is why those who are concerned by an Iran which is more aggressive regionally and which is flexing its muscles all over the Middle East now, those who are concerned about it do not view it with favor. And Israel is not alone in that position. Many within the Middle East itself, key countries are equally apprehensive about that. But that's the situation that it is. At the moment we're there, I can assure you that Israel will manage its affair and would have adequate security whichever way it goes. Let us not be frightened of anything. Israel has ample capabilities of its own to handle any security situation that may develop. And if it is more demanding and taxing, so be it. But I don't think that one should act out of fear, and there is no room to fear at all. There is room to be concerned if Iran becomes nuclear and if it moves more aggressively across the region. That is the Iranian issue. On the other issue, which is on the agenda, the Palestinian issue, here the differences between Israel and the United States or others are not as clear. In fact, on most elements, there is a close proximity in positions between Israel and many of its allies. And I think that while sometimes there may be tactical differences or different methods that need to be employed, the common is so much greater than the dividing that this is not an issue in which you would see a confrontation of the kind that you saw on the Iranian issue. It is so sad that the President of the United States has reconciled himself that the Prime Minister, the elected Prime Minister of Israel, doesn't see eye to eye with him, and that he is about to factor that into the position, and America may take a certain position at the UN or even make clear the kind of formula that it believes is needed when the conflict is settled. Could be. I, for one, not having any preference which is ideological, but being very practical, I would say if it works, fine. Anything that works, fine. I'm all in favor of success. I'm very much apprehensive about failure. Nothing fails like failure, and nothing succeeds like success. So if those positions would help to bring peace and would clear the road and would overcome the obstacles, so be it. But let us not shy away from reflecting that in the last couple of years, some gross mistakes have been made about key countries in managing Middle Eastern affairs. And ranging from North Africa to the Euphrates basin, positions taken have often been turned out to be counterproductive. There have been a misreading of situations, there have been flawed assessments, and there have often been steps taken that backfired. So I wish that in taking positions on the Arab-Israeli issue, the position that would be taken would be such that would be genuinely helpful to peace process, that would bring peace and stability, and not positions which may be, at the time, appear expedient, but in retrospect would turn out to be causing exactly the opposite. So in reflecting about the Arab-Israeli issue, those of you who had the luck, you see, most of you diplomats do not have to deal with the Middle East. Many of you serve in other continents, in other regions, and that's your luck, good luck. We are stuck in this region. Some of you also are stuck in this region. And so the advantage of being stuck in this region is that we have a long memory, and we know the dynamics of history and its relevance. Others have a shorter memory and therefore are more open to looking at issues only against the background of present circumstances. So I'm trying to look backwards, and I remember that exactly 12 years from now, you know, some people, when talking about the elements that the U.S. may choose to borrow in defining its own position on how the Israeli-Arab issue should be resolved, refer to the Clinton parameters. The Clinton parameters have been the positions taken by Clinton immediately after the Camp David negotiations, because the Camp David negotiations at that time was a real-life simulation of the opposing positions. So the president could look at the positions and how they played out, and then draw a kind of a compromise line, which to him reflected a kind of a plausible and fair resolution of the opposing positions, and that were the Clinton parameters. He dictated those parameters before he left office, and many refer to these as possible elements reflecting the American position. Now, if one is going back to the Clinton parameters, and some do, this is an exercise in falling back on historical things. Now, if you do such an exercise, I have another precedent which can help us in organizing our thoughts relative to the issue at hand. The Clinton parameters, I think, was defined in the year 2000. When was that? Yeah. 2000. Well, 3 years later, and 12 years ago, we had a construct called the roadmap. Now, the roadmap is a construct that some members of you sitting around these tables can take credit for, because that was an effort engineered by what was to become the quartet, but was very much the product of very energetic and imaginative European diplomats. It was then embraced by the Americans, and Prime Minister Blair rushed to Washington in December 2003, saying that that roadmap ought to be declared just in time for the intended attack on Iraq in March 2003. And when was that? 3. Therefore, it was December 2002, the roadmap, because it was before the Iraq war. Anyway, that was a very interesting blueprint, which later on became, in fact, the only blueprint that was accepted by all concerned. So it has tremendous legitimacy. The Palestinians accepted it. An Israeli right-wing prime minister, terrible right-winger, called Ariel Sharon not only accepted it, but made it a conditional on entering his own cabinet. So he embraced the roadmap too. And of course, a quartet had been created. The quartet existed only for that purpose as a consequence of that. And the quartet representing the EU, the UN, Russia, and America. A nice combination which reflects in so many ways the entire international community, but within a quartet format. Now, what was the roadmap? What were the guiding principles of that? So let me remind you about the ingredients because they would be interesting. In the first place, near as I can remember, in the preamble to the roadmap, there is this usual listing of, previous precedents, and there is an allusion to the Arab initiative, to the Saudi initiative. Now, one can say elliptically that Israel, by accepting the roadmap in which there is reference to the Saudi initiative, in an indirect way acknowledged the existence of that initiative, if you want to play games. Technically, it's true. Israel did not oppose, did not say it accepted a solution, a formula that acknowledges the existence of the Saudi initiative. But of course, all the other, the UN resolutions and the various, all these sources of authority that are often referred to. But then the blueprint itself consisted of the following elements: that one should move towards final peace between Israel and Palestinians in 3 stages, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, which would all be collapsed into 3 glorious years. This is a contribution of Shimon Peres. He was convinced that the job can be done in 3 years. Because you'd ask yourself, why 3 years? Why not 4.5? Why not 2? So 3 it was. So 3 stages. It was called a performance-based blueprint or roadmap. Now, the elements of the first stage involved clearing the tables. What the Israelis were asked to do, in addition to a few things, was to implement a Mitchell report which called for the first time to freeze settlement activity. There you have it. Settlement activity was to be frozen. But the Palestinians were called upon to implement the Tenet plan, Tenet being the head of the CIA previously, which called for the collection of all illegal weapons and essentially demilitarizing, in so many ways, all the Palestinian areas. And a very elaborate plan it was, how to move into Gaza. Gaza was there, a hotbed of small type of weapons, and these were to be systematically collected, and security would be imposed. Upon satisfactory performance of these 2 steps, one could move to the second stage. And the second stage was nothing short than declaring a Palestinian state, allowing a Palestinian state, albeit with provisional borders. That was it. Second stage, a Palestinian state would come into being with an open border dispute, but the Palestinian would be. That was the first time that Israel had agreed to that, and no less than Sharon himself. Again, remember, a right-wing, a Likud leader at that time, just like we have now in Netanyahu, who is technically a Likud leader. And he agreed to that. And then the third phase was supposed to consist of an international conference in which a mechanism would be placed to resolve all the other outstanding final status issues: Jerusalem, refugees, final borders, and the rest. So that was the plan. Now, the plan, therefore, was a phased plan, but it had a certain logic to it. The logic was structurally sound, security being essential from the very beginning, and demilitarization of all terrorist infrastructures, as it was called. So it was a very, very sound, and it acquired tremendous international legitimacy because everybody accepted it. Palestinians, Israelis, and all members of the international community. Now, what did happen after that? Well, when it comes to the Palestinian side, not only was there no collection and dismantling of any terrorist infrastructures, but actually an area that the same Sharon decided to unilaterally evacuate a year after that, Gaza, became a huge arsenal of weapons of types that no one at the time ever suspected might come into the area. You all know. All those thousands of rockets, they've been established after the fact. So it was, in a way, the process went into exactly the wrong direction. And who came to power as a result of elections initially in Gaza? The terrorists. And then who fought out the security forces of the Palestinian Authority? The Hamas. So in Gaza, we had a process which went exactly the opposite way. But Israel evacuated Gaza unilaterally, and it's gone. Not 1 inch is under Israeli control in Gaza. On the West Bank, things remained with a PA in charge, but it has not done much. And in recent years, it was not even very enthusiastic to come into negotiations. It became very reluctant to enter negotiations, even after Israel did apply the Mitchell notion of freezing settlement activity for some 10 months, and it was willing to do more. They didn't come to negotiations, and as you know, the Palestinians now are bent on an international spree, which has got many objectives to it, but certainly is not engagement and is not a process of going forward. Furthermore, now the Palestinian position is completely opposed to a phased approach. From a position in the 90s, about 15 years ago, when I was advisor to the Prime Minister, we floated with Arafat the idea, why don't we go straight to final status discussions instead of going through the interim measures that the Oslo process dictated? At that time, Arafat said, not for the life of you. I want a gradual approach. I want every pound of flesh in the interim. You are trying to deceive us by leapfrogging to a final status. So, a refusal of a phased approach, and an insistence on a phased approach, and a refusal of a comprehensive deal. Now, the Palestinian position is exactly the inverse. There is a rejection of a phased approach, an insistence, it's all or nothing, and we want to know ahead what the final outcome would be. All you can say is, therefore, that the Palestinian position is highly elastic. At one period, it favors that. At another period, it favors something else. Israel's position is flexible on this point. And I would tell you now that I think all reasonable people today who look at the situation can see no way in which one can reconcile all the outstanding issues in the context of a comprehensive approach. So it doesn't serve much to declare what long-term aims are, but if you do want to have progress, the only reasonable progress you can have is one which you move where you can move, and you do what's doable, and you do not mortgage the simplest things to the most difficult ones. Now you cannot have an agreement on sewage on the West Bank unless you resolve the Jerusalem issue. That's insane. Now, therefore, if one were to take a practical approach and want to see progress, the only thing that should be done, in fact, and could be done, is to relax some of those conditions that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and that you want to know ahead what the final thing will look like. If you make that as a condition, you actually stifle anything that you could do in the interim. So what is needed instead is a practical, phased, gradual process in which there would be permanent progress all the time. How far? To what the traffic would allow. And there are many areas in which you could, but to do that, you have to change the Palestinian position. You have to change the Palestinian position into being willing to engage in a negotiating process, and in which one would have progress wherever we can have progress, without linking that or indexing that to complete resolution of all the other outstanding issues, some of which are, according to current positions, irreconcilable. So this is where we're at. And if that is the case, interestingly enough, there are some in Europe, particularly those who have been among the architects of the roadmap, who think maybe we should revisit the roadmap. The structure was not silly. Remember, it allowed for a Palestinian state. It left open the issue of final borders. Not bad. It allows for certain sequence. It's there, and it still has the validity of having been accepted at the time by all concerned. So maybe that should be the more practical way to move forward, rather than engage in statements which may strike as politically sensible to some, but deprive one of progress. And progress we must have. I believe we must, we can. I wish the positions taken by countries that can influence the process would be such that would help it gather momentum and yield results, because as having been involved in that, I can tell you there are so many things that could and should be done in the context of process. Not posturing, not going internationally, not scoring negotiating points, but actually working on the ground and moving steadily forward. That would be the most productive way of going about it. Will that be the policy taken? I'm not sure. Pretext could always be found for being obstructionist or negative. That would be a pity. But at the end of the way, unless there is an outbreak of hostilities, at the end there would be negotiations. But hopefully one should have people of stature and statesmanship who can actually lead into a process which is at the same time productive and fair. And that is where I think we stand on that issue. One last comment, because Gerald spoke about it and said about our legacy of self-determination and self-reliance. Well, Gerald, no nation can be self-reliant. Even America needs allies. In today's world, when you have some serious problems, you must pool your resources. Look at how much Europe is spending on defense. I just came from the Munich Security Conference. The major subject was whether Europe would rise up to its obligations to fund and finance some of its defense requirements. And one way of getting to things to be done is by creating coalitions and alliances and working with partners, like-minded partners, and pooling your resources. America cannot move effectively unilaterally, and certainly Israel cannot. Israel has consistently been, since its very creation, I wouldn't call it dependent, but was working on certain issues together with allies. At no point were we completely independent. In our modern history, we like to say that we had superpower patronage patrons. We had three. The last one is our special relationship with America, as you all know, which, however, is now getting very, very dicey. There is a very large body of content to the cooperation between Israel and America in so many ways. But before America, people remember the glorious time of our French alliance. What people do not remember, but before the French, there were the British. We fought under the British flag, and we fought to get the British out of this place. We had a love-hate relationship, but an alliance it was. And guess what? Even today, when you look at the visit of the Israeli delegation to Europe, and in confronting, for example, the Iranian problem, the same allies. It's primarily America, Britain, France, and others. Germany comes to the fore, and so forth and so on. So Israel likes to refer to itself as self-reliant, does practice its right to do so, but very much in the context of real and substantive relationship of alliance, which is primarily anchored at the West, and still is, in spite of some Asian alternative openings. But that does not change anything of Israel's international handling, and it is a policy. And then when you are a member of an alliance, you take note of that, and one should not pretend to be able to act unilaterally. Doesn't exist in this world, and is not wise to seek that position. I'll stop here. Thank you.